Hi guys, and welcome to Global Crime Time. Like always, please smash a like on this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Don't forget the notification bell so you know when my videos come out. Bit of a warning on this one. Some of the stuff you're going to hear is of a graphic and disturbing nature, so please bear that in mind before watching. In the mid-19th century, the parish of Whitechapel in London's East End became increasingly overcrowded, with the population increasing to approximately 80,000 inhabitants by 1888. Work and housing conditions worsened, robbery, violence and alcohol dependency were commonplace, and poverty drove many women to prostitution. In October 1888, it was estimated that there were 62 brothels and 1,200 women working as prostitutes in Whitechapel. Between 1886 and 1889, frequent demonstrations led to police intervention and public unrest. But in the autumn of 1888, a series of vicious and grotesque murders occurred, leaving prostitutes feeling scared to work. These murders were carried out by a man only known as Jack the Ripper. Mary Ann Nichols led a brief life marked with hardships. Born to a London locksmith in 1845, she went on to marry Edward in 1864 and gave birth to 5 children before the marriage dissolved in 1880. In explaining the roots of the separation, Nichols' father accused Edward of having an affair with a nurse who attended one of their children's births. For his part, Edward claimed that Nichols' drinking problems drove them to part ways. After they separated, the court required Edward to give his estranged wife 5 shillings per month, a requirement he successfully challenged when he found out that she was working as a prostitute. Nichols then lived in and out of workhouses until her death. She tried living with her father, but they did not get along, so she continued to work as a prostitute to support herself. Though she once worked as a servant in the home of a well-off family, she quit because of her employees did not drink. On the night of her death, Nichols found herself surrounded by the same problems she had had for the majority of her life: lack of money and a prosperity to drink. On August the 31st, 1888, she left the pub where she was drinking and walked back to the boarding house where she planned to sleep for the night. Nichols lacked the funds to pay for the entrance fee, so she went back in an attempt to earn it. According to her roommate, who saw her before she was killed, whatever money Nichols did earn, she spent on alcohol. The body of Mary Ann Nichols was discovered at about 3:40 a.m. on Friday the 31st of August 1888 in Bucks Road, Whitechapel. Nichols was last seen alive approximately 1 hour before the discovery of her body by Mrs. Emily Holland, walking in the direction of Whitechapel Road. Her throat was severed by 2 deep cuts, one of which completely severed all the tissue down to her vertebrae. Her vagina had been stabbed twice, and the lower part of her abdomen was partly ripped open by a deep jagged wound, causing her bowels to protrude. Several other incisions inflicted to both sides of her abdomen had also been caused by the same knife. Each of these wounds had been inflicted in a downward thrusting manner. Mary Nichols' body was removed from the mortuary on the Thursday the 6th of September 1888 and was taken to the undertaker in Hanbury Street. Great secrecy was maintained concerning the arrangements for her funeral, which took place later that same day in order to keep the curious crowds at bay. Mary Nichols was buried at the City of London Cemetery. Although her final resting place no longer exists, the cemetery authorities do maintain a memorial plaque to her in the cemetery's Garden of Remembrance, to which a regular stream of visitors make their way each year to pay their respects. Many of the visitors leave flowers and coins on the plaque. The coins are presumably in remembrance of the fact she lacked the 4 pence for her bed on the day of the murder, and in so doing, they ensure that Mary Nichols, murdered on August the 31st, 1888, is not forgotten. Chapman didn't always lead a hard life. She lived for some time with her husband, John, a coachman in West London. After the couple had children, however, her life began to unravel. Her son John was born disabled, and her youngest daughter Emily died of meningitis. She and her husband both began to drink heavily and eventually separated in 1884. After the separation, Chapman moved to Whitechapel to live with another man. While she still received 10 shillings per week from her husband, she sometimes worked as a prostitute to supplement her income. When her husband died from alcohol abuse, that money stopped, and according to her friends, Chapman seemed to have given away altogether. A week before she died, Chapman got into a fist fight with another woman over an unreturned bar of soap. On Saturday the 8th of September 1888, the body of Annie Chapman was discovered at approximately 6 a.m. near the steps to the doorway of the backyard of 29 Hanby Street, Spitalfields. As in the case of Mary Ann Nichols, the throat was severed by 2 deep cuts. Her abdomen had been cut entirely open, with a section of the flesh from her stomach being placed upon her left shoulder and another section of skin and flesh plus her small intestines being removed and placed above her right shoulder. Chapman's autopsy also revealed that her uterus and sections of her bladder and vagina had been removed. At the inquest into Chapman's murder, Elizabeth Long described having seen Chapman standing outside 29 Hanby Street at about 5:30 a.m. in the company of a dark-haired man wearing a brown deerstalker hat and of shabby appearance. According to this eyewitness, the man had asked Chapman the question, "Will you?" to which Chapman had replied, "Yes." Annie was buried on the 14th of September 1888 in Manor Park Cemetery. Unfortunately, the cemetery when we got there was shut, so I'd done the best I could with just the drone without access to the actual cemetery to film Annie Chapman's grave. Great secrecy was maintained over the funeral arrangements of Annie Chapman in order to prevent the public from learning either the time or the place of her funeral. Later that day, the Globe published a brief report giving the known details of the funeral and burial. The funeral of Annie Chapman, victim of the Whitechapel murderer, took place early this morning. The utmost secrecy was observed in the arrangements, and none but the undertaker, the police and the relatives of the deceased knew anything about it. Shortly after 7 o'clock, a hearse drew up outside the mortuary in Montague Street and the body was quickly removed. At 9 o'clock, a start was made for Manor Park Cemetery, the place selected by the friends of the deceased, but no coaches followed, as it was desired that public attention should not be attracted. Mr. Smith and other relatives met the body at the cemetery and the service was duly performed in the ordinary manner. The remains of the deceased were enclosed in a black-covered elm coffin which bore the words, "Annie Chapman, died September the 8th, 1888, aged 48 years. The area of her grave has long since been reused, and so the actual grave itself, which was a public grave, no longer exists. However, in 2008, the cemetery authorities marked the approximate site of the location of her grave with a plaque, and it is this that we are visiting. Elizabeth Stroyd was a Swedish-born domestic servant who arrived in England in 1866, at which point she had already given birth to a stillborn baby and been treated for venereal diseases. Stroyd married in 1869, but they soon split and he ultimately died of tuberculosis. Stroyd would instead tell people that her husband and children, which they never actually had, died in the infamous 1878 Thames River steamship accident, and that she sustained an injury during that ordeal, which explained her stutter. With her husband gone and lacking a steady source of income, like so many of Jack the Ripper's victims, she turned to prostitution. Stroyd split the remainder of her life living between work and lodging houses. On the night of her death, witnesses say they saw Stroyd kissing or speaking with a respectable looking gentleman, but he was never identified. Stroyd's body was discovered at approximately 1 a.m. in Dutfield's Yards off Berners Street in Whitechapel. The cause of death was a single clear-cut incision measuring 6 inches across her neck, which had severed her left artery and trachea before stopping beneath her right jaw. The absence of any further mutilations to her body has led to uncertainty as to whether Stroyd's murder was the Ripper or whether he was interrupted during the attack. Several witnesses later informed police they had seen Stroyd in the company of a man in or close to Berners Street on the evening of 29th of September and in the early hours of the 30th of September. They each gave different descriptions. Some said that her companion was fair, others dark. Some said that he was shabbily dressed, others well dressed. Very little information is available about Elizabeth Stroyd's funeral, apart from she was buried on Saturday the 6th of October 1888 in the East London Cemetery, located within the East London district of Plaistow. Her funeral was attended by a small number of mourners and the costs were provided at the expense of the parish by the undertaker, Mr. Hawkes. Her headstone is inscribed with her name and the years of her birth and death. Unlike the others among Jack the Ripper's victims, Katherine Eddowes never married and instead spent her short life with multiple men. At age 21, she met Thomas Conway in her hometown of Wolverhampton. The couple lived together for 20 years and had 3 children together. According to her daughter, Annie, the pair split entirely on account of her drinking habits. Eddowes met John Kelly soon after. She then became known as Kate Kelly and stayed with John until her death. According to her friends and family, while Katherine was not a prostitute, she was an alcoholic. The night of her murder, the same night that Elizabeth Stroyd was killed, a policeman found Katherine lying drunk and passed out on Aldgate Street. Katherine Eddowes is one of the prostitutes who regularly walked Aldgate High Street waiting for city clients, but is kept on the move by police. The women are threatened with arrest and being locked up in a police cell if they loiter in the street. They get round this by hurrying around the back of St Botolph's church to avoid having their collar felt, then returning to the front and walking very slowly to try and pick up customers without being caught. St Botolph's acquires a reputation as the prostitutes' church as a result of this practice. The night Eddowes dies, she gets so drunk she runs up and down the street in between the horse carriages, then finally collapses on the pavement outside St Botolph's. He arrested her, taking her to a nearby police station where she could sleep off the alcohol. When asked her name at the station, she replied, "Nothing." Around 1 a.m, authorities released Eddowes, who began walking back to Aldgate Street. Eddowes' body was found in a corner of Mitre Square in the City of London, 3/4 of an hour after the discovery of the body of Elizabeth Stroyd. Her throat was severed from ear to ear and her abdomen ripped open by a long, deep and jagged wound before her intestines had been placed over her right shoulder, with a section of intestine being completely detached and placed between her body and left arm. The left kidney and major part of Eddowes' uterus had been removed and her face had been disfigured, with her nose severed, her cheeks slashed and cuts measuring 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 an inch respectively, vertically incised through each of her eyelids. A triangular incision, the apex of which pointed towards Eddowes' eye, had also been carved upon each of her cheeks, and a section of her lobe of her right ear was later recovered from her clothing. The police surgeon who conducted the post-mortem upon Eddowes' body stated his opinion that these mutations would have taken at least 5 minutes to complete. A local cigarette salesman named Joseph Laund had passed through the square with 2 friends shortly before the murder, and he described seeing a fair-haired man of shabby appearance with a woman who may have been Eddowes. Lauden's companions were unable to confirm his description. The murders of Stroyd and Eddowes ultimately became known as the double event. A section of Eddowes' bloodied apron was found at the entrance to a house in Goulston Street, Whitechapel at 2:55 a.m. A chalk inscription upon the wall directly above this piece of apron read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." This graffiti became known as the Goulston Street graffiti. The message appeared to imply that a Jew or Jews in general were responsible for the series of murders, but it is unclear whether the graffiti was written by the murderer on dropping the section of apron or was merely incidental and nothing to do with the case. Such graffiti were commonplace in Whitechapel. Police Commissioner Charles Warren feared that the graffiti might spark anti-Semitic riots and ordered the writing washed away before dawn. On the afternoon of Monday the 6th of October 1888, the body of Katherine Eddowes began its final journey from the mortuary in Golden Lane, where it had been kept since her murder, to the City of London cemetery, where she was laid to rest. Trouble arose also with regard to the burial of the murdered women, her relatives and friends having next to no money. This, however, was soon overcome, Mr. Charles Hawkes, undertaker of Banner Street, St Luke's, offering to pay the entire cost of the funeral. His offer was readily accepted by the deceased relatives. An open hearse drove up the mortuary gate, followed at some distance behind by a mourning coach. The body of the deceased woman, which had been placed in a handsome polished elm coffin with a plate in gilt letters with the following inscription, "Katherine Eddowes, died September 30th, 1888, aged 43 years, was then brought out of the mortuary and placed on the funeral car. The service both in the chapel and at the grave was conducted by the Reverend T. Dunscombe, the cemetery chaplain, who made no reference to the murder." Just like Mary Ann Nichols, Katherine Edwards was buried at the City of London cemetery. No trace of her grave exists either. The cemetery authorities do maintain a memorial plaque to her in the cemetery's Garden of Remembrance. Mary Jane Kelly was said to be born in Limerick, Ireland, and after her family moved to Wales, she married at the tender age of 16 to a man named Davis. However, She was widowed just a few years later when her husband was killed during a mining explosion. Mary Jane Kelly then moved to Cardiff, where she allegedly fell into the world of prostitution and is believed to have spent time with a well-to-do gentleman. It is said that Mary arrived in the East End of London between 1883 and 1884. Mary Jane Kelly was considered to be the last of the Canonical Five Jack the Ripper victims, and largely due to the brutality, horrific nature of her murder, has become the most famous victim of them all. An unconfirmed story claimed that Mary Jane Kelly was seen on the evening of the 8th of November drinking with Elizabeth Foster in the 10 Bells pub. Two important sightings then occurred. The first took place at 11:45 p.m. when Mary Ann Cox of 5 Millers Court saw Mary, worse for the drink, going into her room with an unidentified, blotchy-faced man. And at 2 a.m. on the morning of the 9th of November, the second important sighting occurred. George Hutchinson, who knew Mary, met her on Commercial Street. She asked him for money, but as he had none to give, she bid him farewell and continued on her way. She was then approached by an unusually well-dressed man just by the entrance to Thrall Street, who put his hand on her shoulder before the pair burst out laughing. The couple then walked up Commercial Street into Dorset Street and entered Mary's room. Dorset Street. Here we have a street which has an attempted murder at least once a month. A murder in every house, and one house at least a murder in every room. Policemen patrol in pairs. The criminals of tomorrow are being bred there today. In Dorset Street you will find common thieves, pickpocketers, the men who rob with violence, and unconvicted murderers. It is said that if you are not known in Dorset Street and you can make it from one end of Dorset Street to the other with your wallet and even your life, then you are lucky. Dorset Street truly was hell on earth. Dorset Street can no longer be found, but on the site where Dorset Street used to be are these brass markings which lay out where Dorset Street was. Now, Mary Ann's room would be where the security barriers now are. That's where Mary Kelly's room would have been. At approximately 4 a.m, less than 2 hours later, two residents of Millers Court heard the cry of murder, but chose to ignore it as the shouts of this nature were rather common occurrences in Dorset Street. The following morning, on 9th of November 1888, landlord John McCarthy sent his assistant Thomas Boyer to room 13 at 11:45 to collect Mary's outstanding rent arrears. Boyer knocked on the door of Mary's room but received no reply. He decided to go around to the windows. Noticing the pane of broken glass, he then put his hand inside to pull aside the curtain. Peering into the gloom of the room, Boyer saw the body of Mary Jane Kelly lying on the bed in the most appalling condition, literally ripped and hacked to pieces. The whole of the surface of the abdomen and thighs was removed and the abdominal cavity emptied of its organs. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition. The tissues of the neck were severed all round down to the bone. The organs were found in various places, the uterus and kidneys with one breast under the head, the other breast by the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestines by the right side, and the spleen by the left side of the body. The flaps removed from the abdomen and thighs were on the table. The pericardium was open below and the heart was missing from the crime scene. Multiple ashes found within the fireplace at 13 Millers Court suggested Kelly's murderer had burned several combustible items to illuminate the single room as he mutilated her body. A recent fire had been severe enough to melt the solder between a kettle and its spout, which had fallen into the grate of the fireplace. Even Queen Victoria had become concerned by the police's inability to catch Jack the Ripper, and she had written to the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, to tell him in no uncertain terms that this new most ghastly murder shows the absolute necessity for some very decided actions. All these courts must be lit and our detectives improved. They are not what they should be. A little after 12:30 p.m, a coffin of elm and oak was carried at St Leonard's Church in Shoreditch on the shoulders of 4 men. As the crowd watched, many of them grief-stricken, the coffin was placed on a horse-drawn hearse. At this point, the crowd surged forward and those at the front were able to read the simple inscription on the casket's brass plate. Mary Jeanette Kelly died November the 9th, 1888, aged 25 years. 3 large wreaths, marks of respect from those who drank in the same pubs as Mary, adorned the coffin. A card on one of them bore the message, "A last tribute to respect Mary Kelly. May she rest in peace. and may her murderer be brought to justice. As the procession set off for St Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone, anguished faces looked on as the procession trundled through the streets of the East End. So many people turned out to escort Mary Kelly on her final journey that despite being only a distance of 6 miles, it took till 2 o'clock for the procession to finally reach the cemetery. Here it was met by the Reverend Father Columban, and the coffin was lifted from the hearse and lowered into the grave. Within moments, the grave had been filled in, and Mary Kelly, the last of the Jack the Ripper victims, had been laid to rest. The vast majority of the City of London police files relating to their investigation into the Whitechapel murders were destroyed in the Blitz. A large team of policemen conducted house-to-house inquiries throughout Whitechapel. Forensic material was collected and examined. Suspects were identified, traced, and either examined more closely or eliminated from the inquiry. More than 2,000 people were interviewed, upwards of 300 people were investigated, and 80 people were detained. Following the murders of Stroyd and Eddowes, the Commissioner of the City Police, Sir James Fraser, offered a reward of £500 for the arrest of Jack the Ripper. The investigation was conducted by the Metropolitan Police Whitechapel Criminal Investigation Department, headed by Detective Inspector Edmund Reed. After the murder of Nichols, Detective Inspectors Frederick Aberline, Henry Moore and Walter Andrews were sent from Central Office at Scotland Yard to assist. The City of London Police were involved under Detective Inspector James McWilliam after the Eddowes murder, which occurred within the City of London. The overall direction of the murder inquiries was hampered by the fact that the newly appointed head of the CID, Robert Anderson, was on leave in Switzerland between the 7th of September and the 6th of October, during a time when Chapman, Stroyd and Eddowes were killed. This prompted Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren to appoint Chief Inspector Donald Swanson to coordinate the inquiry from Scotland Yard. Butchers, slaughterers, surgeons and physicians were suspected because of the manner of the mutilations. A note from Major Henry Smith, Acting Commissioner of the City Police, indicates that the alibis of local butchers and slaughterers were investigated, with the result that they were eliminated from the inquiry. Some high-profile figures, including Queen Victoria, thought the pattern of the murders pointed to the murderer being a butcher or cattle drover on one of the cattle boats in between London and mainland Europe. Whitechapel was close to the docks, and usually boats docked on Thursday or Friday and departed on Saturday or Sunday. The cattle boats were examined, but the dates of the murders did not match with a single boat's movements, and the transfer of a crewman between boats was also ruled out. The failure of the police to capture the killer reinforced the attitude held by critics that the police were inept and mismanaged. In September 1888, a group of volunteer citizens in London's East End formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. They patrolled the streets looking for suspicious characters, partly because of the failure of the police to find the murderer. At the end of October, Robert Anderson asked Police Surgeon Thomas Bond to give his opinion on the extent of the murderer's surgical skill and knowledge. Bond's assessment was based on his own examination of the most extensively mutilated victim and the post-mortem notes from the 4 previous murders. He wrote, "All 5 murders, no doubt, were committed by the same hand. In the first 4, the throats appear to have been cut from left to right. In the last case, owing to the extensive mutilation, it is impossible to say in what direction the fatal cut was made. But arterial blood was found on the wall in splashes close to where the woman's head must have been lying. All the circumstances surrounding the murders lead me to form the opinion that the women must have been laying down when murdered, and in every case the throat was cut. There is no evidence the perpetrator engaged in sexual activity with any of the victims, yet psychologists suppose that the penetration of the victims with a knife and leaving them on display in sexually degrading positions, with the wounds exposed, indicates that the murder got sexual pleasure from the attacks. In addition to the contradictions and unreliability of contemporary accounts, attempts to identify the murderer are hampered by any lack of surviving forensic evidence. DNA analysis on letters is inconclusive. The available material has been handled many times and is too contaminated to provide results. Over the course of the Whitechapel murders, the police, newspapers and other individuals received hundreds of letters regarding the case. Some letters were offers of advice of how to catch the killer, but the vast majority were either hoaxes or generally useless. Hundreds of letters claim to have been written by the killer himself, and 3 of these in particular are prominent: the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter. The Dear Boss letter, dated the 25th of September and postmarked the 27th of September 1888, was received that day by the Central News Agency and was forwarded to Scotland Yard on the 29th of September. Initially it was considered a hoax, but when Eddowes was found 3 days after the letter's postmark with a section of one ear cut from her body, the promise of the author to clip the lady's ears off gained attention. Eddowes' ear appears to have been nicked by the killer incidentally during his attack, and the letter writer's threat to send the ears to the police was never carried out. The name Jack the Ripper was first used in this letter and gained worldwide notoriety. The Saucy Jackie postcard was postmarked the 1st of October 1888 and was received the same day by the Central News Agency. The handwriting was similar to the Dear Boss letter and mentioned the murders committed on the 30th of September. The From Hell letter was received by George Lusk, leader of the Whitechapel Vigilante Committee, and 16th of October 1888. The letter came with a small box in which Lusk discovered half a human kidney, preserved in spirits of wine. Eddowes' left kidney had been removed by the killer. The writer claimed that he fried and ate the missing kidney half. The kidney was examined by Dr. Thomas Openshaw of the London Hospital, who determined that it was a kidney from the left side. Openshaw subsequently also received a letter signed Jack the Ripper. Scotland Yard published copies of the Dear Boss letter and the postcard on 3rd of October in vain hope that a member of the public would recognise the handwriting. On the 7th of October 1888, George R. Sims in the Sunday newspaper Referee implied scathingly that the letter was written by a journalist to hurl the circulation of a newspaper. Officials later claimed to have identified a specific journalist as the author of both the Dear Boss letter and the postcard. The journalist was identified as Tom Bullen in a letter from Chief Inspector John Littlechild to George R. Sims, dated 23rd of September 1913. A journalist named Fred Best reportedly confessed in 1931 that he and a colleague at the Star had written the letters signed Jack the Ripper to heighten interest in the murders and keep the business alive. The killings have always been around weekends and public holidays and within a short distance of each other, leading to the possibility that the Ripper was in regular employment and lived locally. Others have thought that the killer could be an educated upper-class man, possibly a doctor or an aristocrat, or who ventured into Whitechapel from a more well-to-do area. Suspects proposed years after the murders include virtually anyone remotely connected to the case by contemporary documents, as well as many famous names who were never considered in the police investigation, including a member of the British royal family, an artist, and a physician. Everyone alive at the time is now long dead, and modern authors are free to accuse anybody. There are many theories about the actual identity and profession of Jack the Ripper, but authorities are not agreed upon any of them, and a number of named suspects reaches over 100. Despite continued interest in the case, the Ripper's identity remains unknown. The Jack the Ripper murders had reached their peak by the 30th of September 1888 with the double murder of Elizabeth Stroyd and Katherine Edwards. Huge public outcry spread like wildfire across London. The Ripper's bloodlust seemingly knew no bounds, and the police had every reason to believe that a repeat event was on the cards for the following weekend. They were also enough to realise that their best chance of catching the fiend was nabbing him in the act. On Friday the 5th of October, the Star newspaper stated, "Extreme vigilance is now being exercised by the police in Whitechapel. The whole place swarms with detectives and men in uniform. It was feared that the murderer would again select Saturday morning for another crime, and they knew that unless he was caught red-handed, there would be no evidence against him." The police searched every house in the immediate area. Landlords were questioned about suspicious guests, and it was estimated that around 500 informants were told to keep their eyes open on every corner. It's possible that Jack the Ripper could have been placed in prison for an unrelated crime, or possibly an asylum, by family members fearing for his sanity. We have seen this in modern cases where serial killers have been taken off the street for something other than murders they have committed. One such case was the Boston Strangler. Albert the Salvo, who after committing 13 murders was arrested for rape and sexual assault. It wouldn't be until later, whilst in prison, that he had confessed to his cellmate about who he really was. Had he not confessed, the case may have remained unsolved. The same would have applied for Jack the Ripper, had been locked around asylum due to deteriorating mental health issues. In the East End of London, life was short. Disease and malnutrition were rife. Many people were homeless and some were alcoholics, living a poor day-to-day existence in the slums of Whitechapel. Had the Ripper been from the same social class as his unfortunate victims, then dying at a fairly young age was not uncommon. The Ripper could have succumbed to any number of diseases that had inhabited the area. Another theory was that Jack the Ripper had simply emigrated and left the country. A theory that has become increasingly popular due to the modern criminal profiling suggests that Jack the Ripper may have stopped killing because he came too close to capture. Such a scare may have brought home how lucky he was, or faced with near capture, he may have been aware that the police were onto him, so he decided to keep a low profile. It's unknown if the police ever had their sights on one man and tried their best to nail him for the crimes, but lacked the evidence to do so. If they did, then the records have not survived to tell us. Perhaps in time some new evidence will emerge from the hidden vaults of Scotland Yard, which will shed new light onto why the world's most famous serial killer suddenly vanished into the shadows forever.